My name is Tim, and I'm going to search for the last unique score in NHL history. If you're a sports nerd like myself, you may be familiar with SB Nation's John Boyce, specifically his video series Chart Party. In one episode, he takes a look at every NFL score ever, truly interesting because of the multitude of ways there are to score points in football. There are so many ways for a game to end, from the ultra-common 20-17, to 11-10, which has only happened once, to 6-1, which has never happened but is technically possible. He made the video because the process of making a football score, which he refers to as scoreogami, is unique to the sport. Most sports increase their score by a single goal, run, or point at a time. Basketball has plays that result in anywhere between 1 and 5 points, but with 2, 3, 6, 7, and 8 point plays available, scores can become very weird in football, and not just high scores either. Games where a team's point total equals 2, 4, or 5 are very rare. A 2-0 game has happened 5 times in NFL history, but is very common in sports like soccer, baseball, and hockey. As Boyce states, because these scores can only go up by 1, mathematically, a score can only be interesting in terms of magnitude. After watching his video, I began wondering how many unique scores there have been in hockey, and how far back you would have to go to find the last time an outcome happened for the first time. So, like Boyce, I charted every NHL score ever, though my approach was a little different. Looking at Boyce's chart, the top represents the winner and the side represents the loser, while I looked at it in terms of home and away. In Boyce's research, a 20-17 game is the same regardless whether the home or away team won. You can have a box that shares 20 in the x-axis and 17 in the y checked off, but not a box with 17 in the x and 20 in the y. After all, you can't win a game 17-20. But with my x and y axes standing for home and away respectively, 2-1, a home win, and 1-2, a visiting win, count as 2 different outcomes. To make the NHL's 102-year, 61,152 game history easier to digest, I broke it down into 8 different eras. From 1917-18 to 1922-23, you have the beginning, the league's infancy when it was one of just 19 leagues to have a team compete for the Stanley Cup, and featured notable players such as Joe Malone, George Vezina, and Cy Denneny. From 1923-24 to 1928-29 is Dead Puck 1, an era that was so low in scoring there were fewer than 3 goals per game in one season. The same year, the entire Chicago Blackhawks team scored 33 goals in 44 games. This era is known for stars Howie Morenz, King Clancy, and George Hainsworth. From 1929-30 to 1941-42, you have the Top League, when the NHL truly became the best in the world thanks to the efforts of players such as Eddie Shore, Tiny Thompson, and Nels Stewart. From 1942-43 to 1966-67 is the original 6, populated with many legends including Mr. Hockey Gordie Howe, Rocket Richard, and Terry Sawchuk. Following that is the Great Expansion from 1967-68 to 1979-80, in which the league exploded in size, growing from 6 to 21 teams in just 14 years, and is known for players like Bobby Clarke, Bobby Orr, and Phil Esposito. From 1980-81 to 1993-94 is the Live Puck era that saw a drastic increase in scoring thanks to all-time great scorers such as Mario Lemieux, Ray Bourque, and the great one Wayne Gretzky. Following is Dead Puck 2 from 1994-95 to 2003-2004, where scoring dropped thanks to a lot of clutching and grabbing, as well as many all-time great goalies including Patrick Waugh, Martin Brodeur, and Dominik Hasek. Finally, from 2005-2006 to the present, we are in the post-lockout era, where the overall skill and speed of the league has never been higher and features the generational talents of Sidney Crosby, Alex Ovechkin, and Nicklas Lidstrom. So let's go through unique scores year by year. As each season passes, the scores that have been read have happened for the first time. As we go through, I will be stopping to point out important scores, whether they be notable firsts or rare outcomes. Here is the league's first season, where a few scores that stand out are 10-9, 2-11, and 1-0. Oddly enough, all 3 scores involve the Montreal Wanderers, who only played in 4 NHL games and compiled a 1-5 record, something that will make sense in just a moment. The Wanderers defeated the Toronto Arenas 10-9 on December 19, 1917, the very first night in league history, thanks to 5 goals from Harry Hyland and 2 goals and 4 points from Dave Ritchie. The Wanderers were up 10-6 in the third period when the Arenas nearly came back, as 2 of Reg Noble's 4 goals on the night helped bring them within 1. Toronto's 9 goals remain the most ever scored in a loss, a mark that would be tied 5 times, which somehow includes 2 occasions where it happened twice in less than a month. 3 nights later, they lost 2-11 to the Montreal Canadiens, an outcome that would only happen 2 more times in NHL history, and the 1-0 score truly stands out as the Wanderers forfeited twice, once to the Canadiens and once to the Arenas. This occurred after their rink burned down and they disbanded as they were having trouble finding players anyway. It was a disappointing ending for a team that had won the Stanley Cup 4 times, 3 times as a member of the Eastern Canada Amateur Hockey Association and once as a member of the National Hockey Association, and those remain the only 2 forfeits in NHL history. The next season, a few prominent scores are 13-4 and 6-10. The first occurred on January 11th as the Canadiens defeated the Arenas, followed by a Senators loss to the Canadiens 5 days later. Both outcomes only happened 4 times in history. In 1919-20, 3-16, 5-12, 11-6, and 14-7 stand out. The Quebec Bulldogs lost to the Canadiens 5-12 on December 24th, a score that would only occur once more, and the Senators defeated the Bulldogs 11-6 on March 6th, which would only happen 4 more times. The other 2 are truly historic scores, especially in terms of magnitude. The Canadiens visited the Bulldogs on March 3rd and recorded the most goals by a single team in one game, a record still untouched thanks to hat-tricks from 4 different players. Before that, on January 10th, the Canadiens defeated the visiting Toronto St. Pats 14-7, with the 21 combined goals also setting a record that has never been broken. Odie Cleghorn and Didi Diapitre each had hat-tricks for the Canadiens, but the real star was Nuzi Lalonde, who recorded one of the league's 8 6-goal games that night. In 1920-21, there are scores of 12-5 and 13-6. The latter occurred on February 26th as the Canadiens defeated the Hamilton Tigers thanks to hat-tricks from Nuzi Lalonde and Cully Wilson. This would be the only game in league history to end this way. 9 days later, the Tigers were again the victims, this time to Ottawa, who won 12-5, a score fans would see just 2 more times. In 1921-22, we see ties for the first time with 0-0 and 4-4 being significant. The first tie in NHL history happened on February 11th when the St. Pats visited the Ottawa Senators, who were up 4-1 halfway through the second, but a Toronto goal with 5 seconds remaining in the period and 2 in the third evened it up, and a 20-minute overtime solved nothing. On March 13th, Toronto was once again in Ottawa when they played in not only the first scoreless game in NHL history, but the first playoff tie as well, with the goaltenders of record being John Ross Roach for the St. Pats and Clint Benedict for the Senators. This was the second game of a 2-game total goal final that the St. Pats won thanks to a 5-4 win 2 nights earlier in Toronto. Playoff ties were fairly common in the early days of the league, as up until 1935-36, the playoffs largely consisted of total goals series. 23 playoff ties occurred between 1922 and 1935, with one final playoff tie occurring on March 31, 1951, when a Toronto curfew, which prevented games from being played after midnight, halted the first round series between the Toronto Maple Leafs and Boston Bruins as the first overtime drew to a close at 11:45. Bill Barocco would score the only goal for the Leafs that night, just a few weeks before his famous cup-clinching goal in overtime. Finally, in the last season of the league's beginning, there were 4 more scores that occurred for the first time. Here is a heat map to show the overall score distribution of this era. Of the 268 games, 4-3 was the most common score, with the average score being 4.88 to 3.35. Home teams had a great advantage as the .679 winning percentage was the highest of any era, as was the percentage of blowouts, games won by 5 goals or more, and of games that featured 10 or more goals. The low-scoring games and dead puck won prevented any notable scores. Defense dominated the era so much, scores of magnitude were exceptionally rare here. In fact, 19 of the 54 10 shutout seasons occurred during this era, including 10 of the 13 shutout seasons. George Hainsworth of the Canadiens set the single-season record of 22 shutouts in 1928-29 in just a 44-game season, the same year that Joe Miller of the Pittsburgh Pirates recorded 11 shutouts for a team that won just 9 games. There wasn't a very big score distribution, with the most common score being a 1-2 loss, while the average was 2.14 to 1.75. Over 36% of games featured a shutout, nearly 39% were one-goal games, and over half were close games, one-goal games plus ties, and or featured 3 or fewer goals, all the highest percentages of any era. Next, we get to the top league era, where we get a steady supply of new scores each year. In 1935-36, there was an 8-8 game, the highest scoring tie in history. This occurred on February 18th when the New York Americans hosted the Montreal Maroons. The Americans had a 5-2 lead halfway through the game, but the Maroons battled back, scoring 2 goals late in the third period to tie the game up at 7, and each team scored in the continuous 10-minute overtime. This record would be matched 7 times, all in the live puck era. The last was between the New Jersey Devils and Buffalo Sabres right before Martin Brodeur and Dominik Hasek became their respective starting goalies. In 1937-38, there was the only 11-7 game on January 11th. The Maroons defeated the Canadiens thanks in large part to a 7-2 first period and balanced scoring, as 7 players had 3 points. The next season, on March 16th, there was a 5-11 game between the Americans and the New York Rangers, an outcome that only occurred 4 more times. 3 seasons later, we finish up the era, and from the score distribution, you can see the most common score was 2-1, while the average was 2.82 to 2.19. Scoring did see a boost in this era, though it was still relatively low, as these years featured the second highest percentage of contests resulting in a shutout, close score, and between 0 and 3 goals. Now on to maybe the most cherished era of all time, the original 6. 2 seasons in 1943-44, there are 7 new scores, including 3-13 and 15-0. 3-13 occurred on January 2nd between the Rangers and Bruins and would only happen once more, while 15-0 is the largest margin of victory ever. On January 23rd, the Detroit Red Wings demolished the Rangers, never letting up as 8 of their 15 goals came in the third period. Sid Howe, Murray Armstrong, Don Grosso, and Joe Carveth all had 5 points for Detroit, while defenseman Cully Simon was their only player without a point. The game could have been even worse, as Detroit scored seconds after the third period ended, and even if the Rangers were awarded a goal for every shot they had that night, they still would have lost 15-9. The next season is a 14-3 game, of which the Rangers were again on the wrong side of. This time the Bruins were the victor on January 21st, the only time this outcome occurred. Bill Cowley had 4 goals that night, while Frank Mario and Ken Smith also had 4 points. In 1945-46, Detroit loses to Toronto 7-11 on March 17th, an outcome that would only happen once more, while the next season would see the Maple Leafs defeat the Blackhawks 12-4 on March 8th, a score that would only happen 3 more times. Later in the era, we go 9 seasons without any new outcomes until we get to 1956-57. The Maple Leafs defeated the Rangers 14-1 on March 16th, a score that would never happen again. With the exception of defensemen Jimmy Thompson and Jim Morrison, every player on the Leafs had a point that night. The craziest part of this game is the Leafs were the second worst offensive team that season, as Brian and Barry Cullen and Ted Kennedy all recorded at least 18% of their season point totals in this game alone. Moving ahead, the next notable score is in 1963-64 when there was a 0-11 game. On January 18th, the Maple Leafs were crushed by the Bruins, led by Dean Prentice, who had 3 goals and 6 points, though the game didn't matter much. The Bruins would finish last in the NHL that year with an 18-40-12 record, while the Maple Leafs won the Cup that season. There would be no new scores the rest of the original 6 era. For those who are appalled by ties, this era was not kind, as the most common score was 2-2, while the average was 3.21 to 2.55. This 16% of games ending in ties is the largest of any era, and there is also the second most common percentage of games between 4 and 6 goals. As we begin the Great Expansion, there was a 0-12 game early on, the worst home shutout loss in history. This occurred on January 30th as the Philadelphia Flyers lost to the Blackhawks. Jim Pappen had a hat-trick while Pitt Martin and Dennis Hall each had 5 points. Meanwhile, 5 members of the Orange and Black were a -6. Going forward, there are still 1 or 2 scores getting crossed off most seasons. In 1970-71, there was a 13-0 game which the Maple Leafs defeated the Red Wings on January 2nd, an outcome that would only happen once more. In 1972-73, we see 5-10 in which the Vancouver Canucks lost to the Flyers on March 9th, a score that would only happen one more time. In 1974-75, we see 1-11 and 3-11 in which the Washington Capitals lost to the Canadiens on November 10th, and the Maple Leafs lost to the Buffalo Sabres on March 16th. Both scores would only occur one more time each. In 1975-76, we come to another score that only happened once, 14-2. On December 21st, the Sabres hosted the Capitals, who, in their second season, remained arguably the worst team of all time, winning just 19 games over their first 2 seasons. Through 2 periods, the Sabres had a 6-2 lead, but, like the Red Wings-Rangers 15-0 game, they piled it on with 8 goals in the third. Rick Martin had 4, Fred Stanfield had a hat-trick, and 3 others had at least 4 points. The next year, we see 8-10 on February 20th as the Blackhawks lost to the Maple Leafs, a score that would only occur 3 more times. One of those games was in the playoffs, as the highest scoring postseason game of all time occurred between the Edmonton Oilers and Los Angeles Kings on April 7, 1982, in Game 1 of the same series that saw the Kings win one of the greatest games of all time, the Miracle on Manchester. In 1978-79, there was a 12-0 game on February 22nd between the Canadiens and Pittsburgh Penguins, which would only occur one other time. Finishing the era, we get to the score distribution. 4-2 was the most common score, narrowly beating out 3-3 and 2-2, while the average was 3.62 to 2.86. Due to the constant influx of new teams, this was a rather strange era, featuring the second highest percentage of tie games, but also the second highest in blowouts. Shutouts and close games are the second lowest here. In the first year of the live puck era, there was a 14-4 game. On March 19th, the Sabres hosted the Maple Leafs, where they took a 1-0 lead into the second period, where they proceeded to score 9 goals. Gilbert Perreault and Andrew Savard had hat-tricks, while they and 6 others had at least 3 points. Meanwhile, Rob McClanahan somehow finished the game as a -2 for the Sabres. In 1981-82, we see 8-9, 9-8, and 15-2. The 9-8 game happened on October 10th between the Maple Leafs and the Blackhawks and would only occur one other time, less than 2 months later on December 2nd between the Nordiques and Oilers. The 8-9 game occurred on February 27th between the Flames and Flyers and would likewise occur one other time, also involving the Flyers, who lost at home to the New Winnipeg Jets on October 27th, 2011. On November 11th is the 15-2 game, when the old Winnipeg Jets visited the Minnesota North Stars, whose Al McAdam would be the only forward without a goal. Meanwhile, defensemen Fred Barrett and William Nyrock were the only 2 without a point. Bobby Smith had 4 goals on a team record 7 points on the night, while Dino Ciccarelli had 5 points. In 1982-83, there was a 7-10 game between the Penguins and Oilers on February 19th that would only occur once more. And the next year we see 2-12, 6-11, 10-8, and 12-8. 6-11 was on March 3rd between the Maple Leafs and the New York Islanders, while 10-8 was on October 15th between the Maple Leafs and the Blackhawks. The scores would occur 1 and 2 more times respectively. Meanwhile, 2-12 and 12-8 only happened once. On October 19th, the Jets lost to the Canadiens as Mats Naslund had 5 points and 9 others had at least 2. Both of Winnipeg's goals came at a 23-second span in the third period, thanks to a high sticking penalty handed to Guy Lafleur. Then, on January 4th, the Oilers defeated the North Stars in the first game to feature 20 goals in nearly 64 years. Denny Marouk, Dino Ciccarelli, and Brad Maxwell all had 3 points for the North Stars. However, Wayne Gretzky tied his career high of 8 points, which he had actually set earlier that season. Meanwhile, Jari Kurri had a hat-trick and Mark Messier chipped in 6 assists. The next season, there are 2 scores that happened once, 3-12 and 13-2. The first was on October 18th when the Flyers put a beating on the Canucks. 4 Flyers had at least 4 points in a game where 7 players had at least 15 penalty minutes. Just 2 days later, the Quebec Nordiques quadrupled up the Maple Leafs in Toronto. 6 players had 3 points for Quebec, including brothers Peter and Anton Stastny, while brother Marian had 2. In 1985-86, there are scores of 9-12 and 11-9. There have been 4 games in NHL history where there were 20 goals or more. 3 of them involved the Oilers, and 2 happened in less than a month. On December 11th, the Blackhawks lost to the Oilers 9-12. The Oilers had built a 6-goal lead in the second period, though the Hawks managed to pull within 2 later in that same frame. Wayne Gretzky tied an NHL record of 7 assists in one game, which was held by himself and Billy Taylor of the 1946-47 Red Wings. Meanwhile, Jari Kurri and Glenn Anderson both had hat-tricks. The Maple Leafs would then go on to defeat the Oilers 11-9 on January 8th. 6 points apiece from Gretzky and Kurri were not enough to answer the Maple Leafs, who were up 5-1 after one and had 4 goals from Miroslav Fraiture and 3 points from 5 others. The next season, you once again have the Oilers featured in a new outcome, 13-3 over Los Angeles. This occurred in Game 2 of their first round series, and of the 35 scores in league history that have happened 3 times or fewer, this is the only one that included a playoff game. The 13 goals by Edmonton is the most by a single team in postseason history, and the 10-goal lead is the second highest margin of victory. Wayne Gretzky tied Mikko Lehtonen's record of 6 assists in a playoff game, as well as his personal best 7 points. Jari Kurri had 5 points, and 4 others had at least 3. After losing Game 1, this was their first of 8 consecutive wins, as they would go on to win the Cup for the 3rd time in 4 years. Moving ahead 6 seasons, we get 13-1. This game occurred on February 10th as the Calgary Flames hosted the San Jose Sharks. The Sharks actually held a 1-0 lead halfway through the first, but Ronnie Stern and Robert Reichel both had hat-tricks, while Reichel and Theo Fleury both had 6 points. After one more season, the live puck era comes to an end. 4-3 was the most common score, while the average was 3.97 to 3.4. With such a huge uptick in scoring, it's no surprise this era featured the highest percentage of games with 7 to 9 goals and second highest of 10 or more. There was also the lowest number of shutouts and games between 0 and 3 goals, the only era not to have at least 10% in each category. There weren't even a lot of moderate scoring games either, with the second lowest percentage of games between 4 and 6 goals. So we go through the entirety of Dead Puck 2 without a single new outcome, not surprising thanks to the sharp drop in scoring. In 1997-98, there were fewer than 5.5 goals per game for the first time since 1956-57, and the 5.14 goals per game in 2003-2004 remains the lowest of the past 63 years. 3-2 was the most common score, with the average being 2.87 to 2.6. Nearly half of all games featured 4 to 6 goals, the most of any era. Home teams struggled with a .488 winning percentage, the lowest of any era, and it's interesting to note the only 2 eras in which the home team had a winning percentage below .500 are the dead puck eras. But if you like close games, this is the first era in which fewer than 5% of games were blowouts. It should be noted the last ties occurred on April 4th, the last day of the 2003-2004 regular season. One was when the Florida Panthers hosted the Carolina Hurricanes in a 6-6 deadlock in what was the 3rd highest scoring game that year. The Hurricanes had built a 4-0 lead by the end of the first, but needed 2 goals in the final 5 minutes to tie the game. One was by Eric Stahl and the other by Brad Fast, who scored a goal in his only career game that night. The other game was between the Islanders and Flyers, as a Kim Janssen goal tied the game early in the third, and there would be no answer the rest of the game. Now we come to the current era, post-lockout. With a much faster game, you may expect yet another ridiculous score to be crossed off, but despite the puck moving quicker than ever, there hasn't been a huge uptick in scoring. The most common score is once again 3-2, while the average is only slightly higher than Dead Puck 2 at 2.98 to 2.69. Blowouts continue to decline, and home crowds are more likely to leave happy than any time since the beginning. The most notable score here is 2-3, as the first shootout in NHL history went to the visiting Senators over the Maple Leafs on opening night on October 5, 2005. Daniel Alfredson scored both of the Senators' goals in regulation and would score the first shootout goal in history. Danny Heatley sealed the win in the third period after misses from Jason Allison and Eric Lindros. Here's a look at the score distribution of the entirety of NHL's history. The most common outcome by over 500 games is 3-2, with an average of 3.27 to 2.81. There have been 161 different outcomes, with 20 that have only happened once in 61,152 games. Less than 10% of games have resulted in a tie, though that was at 13.33% before ties were eliminated after the lockout. Here is a quick era-by-era comparison. On the left is a bar graph showing what percentage of games within each era resulted in a specific outcome, while the pie chart on the right shows what percentage of all specific outcomes in history occurred in each era. So, in games with shutouts, you can clearly see how much more often they occurred in Dead Puck 1 than any other time, and the decent-sized chunk of the pie graph that era takes up. Nearly 5% of all shutouts occurred at this time, despite only 1.5% of games taking place here. So we've reached the present day, and it's been a while since we last saw a red square, so let's rewind a bit. We go through the entire post-lockout and Dead Puck 2 eras until we come to it at the very tail end of the live puck era. That game between the Flames and Sharks on February 10, 1993 at the Olympic Saddledome on a Wednesday night in the dog days of the season is the last time fans saw an outcome for the first time. Calgary was still a strong team 4 years removed from their only Stanley Cup. Theo Fleury, Gary Roberts, Joe Nieuwendyk, and Robert Reichel all had at least 34 goals, while Gary Suter and Al MacInnis were both point-per-game defensemen. Meanwhile, the Sharks would lose an NHL record 71 games that year, and this loss came at the tail end of the worst stretch of the season, the 19th of a 20-game winless streak. An historically bad season included an historically bad loss, one that may stick around for a while as the last unique score in NHL history. It's been over 26 years since that game, so when are we likely to see a new score again? Well, I looked at the probabilities of the remaining 111 scores. Let's take 13-5 for example. The home team has recorded 13 goals 10 times in history, an average of once every 6,115 games, while the visiting teams recorded 5 goals 5,408 times, once every 11.31 games. Multiplying those numbers together and you can expect to see a 13-5 game about once every 69,163 games. Assuming the NHL stays at an 82-game season and there are no shortened or lockout years, the NHL can expect to play its 69,163rd game sometime late in the 2024-25 season, so we may possibly be due for one sometime soon. I did this with all remaining 104 scores that have not yet happened, excluding ties of course since those are now impossible, and the results are interesting. The most probable score that has not yet happened is 0 to 10. It should occur about once every 22,513 games, so you could expect to have seen it 2 or even 3 times by now. It has come close as a 1 to 10 game has occurred 7 times. The closest any of these games came to being a shutout was the latest, as Dave Gagne of the Flames scored with just over 4 minutes to go to break the shutout against Edmonton. There are 2 other scores, 12 to 6 and 4 to 12, that have a probability less than the number of games in NHL history, but after that the numbers start to skyrocket. 1 to 12 should happen once every 77,255 games, a mark that will be reached sometime in the 2030-31 season, and after that the game totals start reaching the 100,000s, which will occur in the 2046-47 season. At 1 to 13 we've passed 200,000 games, so we're talking the 21-18-19 season. A score of 5 to 14 should happen once every 523,461 games, so you can expect the NHL to play its half-millionth game in the 23-32-33 season. 0 to 14 has a probability of once in more than a million games, which we are on pace to play in the 26-90-91 season. By 10 million games, we are in the 91-28-29 season. 124 million games will be reached in the 90,673-74 season. 311 million in the 224,435-36 season, 747 million in the 536,310-11 season, 935 million in the 670,787-88 season, and 1.86 billion games in the 1,339,445-46 season. Of course, if Futurama is to be believed, by the year 1.5 million, we'll all be enslaved by giraffes anyway, so it probably doesn't matter too much. So I know this was sort of a long-winded way of saying this, but with few exceptions, we have already seen just about every score you could realistically expect to see in an NHL game, barring some drastic rule changes. Of course, harking back to the league's beginning when there were absurd scores like 3 to 16 and 14-7, there were many crazy rules, including goalies being the only players allowed to pass the puck forward in the defensive zone and no forward passing in the offensive zones at all. It was considered groundbreaking when the NHL allowed goalies to fall to their knees to make a save. Before that, in other leagues, it was a minor penalty and a $2 fine. The National Hockey Association, the NHL's precursor, changed from having 6 skaters to 5, eliminating the rover position, and at the time, a minor penalty lasted a full 3 minutes, even if a team scored, so who knows what the game will look like in 50 to 100 years. Thank you so much for watching. I know this was a rather long video, but I hope you found this journey through NHL history as interesting as I did. Let me know in the comments what the weirdest and most unique score you've ever seen is. For me, it would be 3 to 10 when the Flyers lost to the Penguins in Game 4 of their first round series in 2012. That score has only occurred 12 times, and is one of just 3 playoff games in history in which the home team allowed 10 goals. It was miserable at the time, but it is kind of cool looking back and knowing just how rare a game like that is.